While the coordination of our diplomatic, development, and defense activities is key to achieving a coherent foreign policy, I think we continue to harbor serious concerns about the military taking the lead in traditionally civilian-led efforts. Further, in order to ensure that our civilian agencies can take the lead in diplomacy and development, we need to ensure that the resources are allocated appropriately between those agencies. My staff reported back from their time in Africa that state USAID personnel felt overwhelmed by the Department of Defense's involvement with their work. One official reported that she spends fully 1/3 of her time coordinating with the DoD, even though she's already stretched thin in staffing and resources. We can't strike the right civilian-military balance if we do not provide the civilian side with the necessary personnel and funding to effectively do their jobs. We also have to ask that the interagency presence within AFRICOM means for the interagency components that are not within the command, such as the U.S. embassies, USAID programs, and State Department regional bureaus. Are the interagency personnel working within AFRICOM simply there to help DoD learn to coordinate better with other agencies? How will the State Department personnel in AFRICOM, for example, interact with U.S. embassies? And we'll also have to ask whether the continent of Africa is the right place to experiment with a new U.S. interagency model. With growing threats from extremist groups in both East and West Africa, the rise of transnational drug enterprises in West Africa, continuing conflicts across much of Central Africa, and the HIV/AIDS crisis affecting the entire continent, the United States' efforts to help African nations again regain stability, root out corruption, and effectively address internal threats are more important now than ever. This may provide us with the opportunity to try a new approach. At the same time, we cannot forget the seriousness of our endeavors if we're to proceed with such an experiment. In all accounts, we need to unify our message about AFRICOM's goals, strategies, and the role we intend for it to play. The overarching theme of our hearings and the staff's trip to Africa so far, a theme that's been echoed by many in this room, is that communication about AFRICOM's rollout was mishandled. I suspect that this was in large part because the entity doing the communicating, the United States government, had not reached its own decisions about the contours of the new command. For example, at our first hearing of the subcommittee last year, Teresa Whalen, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs, testified, and I quote, "The intent is not for DoD generally or for U.S. AFRICOM at the operational level to assume the lead in areas where state and USAID have clear lines of authority as well as the comparative advantage to lead," end quote. But on that same day, Secretary Gates delivered a speech to the United States Global Leadership Campaign in which he noted, and again I quote, "In recent years, the lines separating war, peace, diplomacy, and development have become blurred and no longer fit the neat organizational charge of the 20th century," close quote. So on the same day, on one side of town, state and USAID were still the agency leads on diplomacy and development, and on the other side of town, the roles of the various agencies were being blurred. Similarly, the potential for confusion could be seen in General Ward's posture statement earlier this year. He notes 3 strategic end states provided by the Department of Defense as guidelines for AFRICOM's activities. Every one of those end states reflect military goals. But at the same time, his description of the strategic environment in which AFRICOM functions highlights the problems of overfishing of Africa's coast and the impact that this has on food security. Now that's an accurate assessment of a challenge facing Africa's coastal nations. It raises the question of what role AFRICOM intends to play in addressing that challenge. But before we're able to clearly and effectively communicate to Africans what our plans are for AFRICOM, we need to figure it out for ourselves. I hope this conference is going to go a long way to helping us do that. Let me just close by highlighting what the AFRICOM experience is instructive as we examine how the United States will face the challenges of the 21st century. As we monitor AFRICOM's progress, we should be cognizant of the lessons we can learn for our government as a whole. What does AFRICOM mean for regional versus bilateral approaches in foreign affairs? What are the implications for U.S. embassies around the world? What does AFRICOM show us about our interagency systems in general? For example, I'm concerned that the lack of civilian capacity in Africa, as compared to AFRICOM's military capacity, is indicative of problems that we see throughout our government due to the excessive outsourcing of civilian work. Can AFRICOM show us what we need to maintain government expertise? And what do the coordination problems on the ground mean for the National Security Council's ability to manage the interagency at an operational level? Finally, what does AFRICOM mean for how the United States approaches threats to our national security. National security today is not what it was either when the Department of Defense or the regional combatant commands were created. Today's threats come not only from hostile governments, but from terrorist organizations that feed off weak states and flourish in ungoverned spaces. In this environment, where education and public health efforts, improvements in the rule of law, and the reduction of corruption can significantly increase the government's ability to combat these new threats, the definition of national security interest is arguably expanded dramatically. If we don't show leadership and foresight, this expanded conception of national security interest could have troubling implications for the civilian-military balance of the United States foreign policy. Robust oversight of AFRICOM's mission, activities, and the role of the African continent will be critical. Moreover, oversight is vital to avoiding various pitfalls, and so the committee plans to lead in those efforts here in Congress. I want to thank you again for inviting me to talk with you today. I look forward to learn a great deal from what emerges from this conference. Thank you.